Hello and welcome to another episode of Levy's Customs. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Asus GL752VW. It is a 17-inch gaming laptop from the last quarter of 2015, so it's about close to 5 years old now. But first, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the channel. Now, it's been about 6 months since I uploaded last, and there's many reasons for it. What is important is that I have several ideas for videos that I just need to shoot and film and all that kind of stuff. But I am going to be continuing this channel. It may not be very often that I upload, but I am still very much wanting to do this. I've been learning a lot more about videography, lighting, stuff like that. So I'm hoping that the videos will continue to improve in quality. Alright, now that we have that taken care of, let's get to the computer we're looking at today. This Asus is a bit heavy. It is 17 inches in terms of the screen, so it is a lot bigger than normal laptops. It also has an aluminum cover, like the top part of the laptop, and it also has an aluminum palm rest, but the bezel for the screen and the bottom are plastic. It was really hard to capture a picture with this, but the logo on the back does light up kind of a reddish orange. It comes with a basic assortment of ports, including a mini display port and a USB 3 Type-C port. Fortunately, it's not 3.1, just the original USB. It also has a DVD Super Multi drive on the right-hand side, and it does have a large exhaust vent on the left. And this takes up a lot of real estate, unfortunately, and usually with gaming laptops, the vent or vents are on the back, so all the hot air is blowing away from the user. The keyboard is backlit in red and feels pretty good to type on. I went ahead and conducted a little test. I put a microphone right next to the keyboard, and then I did a few typing tests, not only to see how easy it was for me to use the keyboard, but also to give you guys an idea of how the keyboard sounds when it is used.
Okay, so that was actually my best, 41 words per minute with 0 mistyped words. So this keyboard's pretty good.
I typically average around 40 words per minute, and with 3 tests, the average was about 37 with this keyboard, so not bad. If I spent more time with this laptop and got used to it, I probably could have gotten up to my average. The speakers are alright, but for a gaming laptop, not so much. They are better than your average budget laptops though, so you know, there's a slight bass, but it is pretty tinny.
So this is the camera and the microphone on this Asus laptop. Looks very, very grainy, and I have a light here and a light back there and another light back there, so that's a lot of light in this room. This is me tapping. Here is typing.
I also noticed with the footage from the webcam that things looked a little bit green, which, you know, not that great, especially with skin tones, and it was really grainy. As you could see, I have all these lights and everything that picks up on my camera perfectly well, but that little webcam, it's pretty crappy looking. Alright, let's move on to the specs of this thing. It has a 17-inch 1080p 60Hz TN panel, a Intel Core i7 6700HQ with 4 cores, 8 threads, a base clock of 2.6 GHz, and a boost clock of 3.5 GHz. It also has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, a 2 gigabyte GTX 960M from NVIDIA, and it had a 1 terabyte hard drive. Now, I did replace the hard drive with a 1 terabyte SATA SSD from ADATA, so I don't think it's going to affect any of the performance, but it definitely helps with loading games. There's also room for a full-sized M.2 SATA drive, so technically you can have 2 drives in this laptop, which is pretty cool. Now let's look at the benchmarks for this thing. Rainbow Six Siege on medium settings got us an average of 55.4 frames per second and a 1% low of 40.8 frames per second. The game ran alright. It did peak into the 60s sometimes, but it usually was in the mid-50s and sometimes dropped into the 40s. If you did turn down the settings to the low preset, then you would definitely be able to maintain an above 60 frame per second average. Shadow of the Tomb Raider on the lowest settings got us an average of 28.8 frames per second and a 1% low of 20.1 frames per second. This game really struggled to get to 30 frames per second. It was pretty annoying at sometimes how much the stutter was happening, and it definitely made the game feel less. Like I just wasn't enjoying it as much if it was a little bit more smoother. Resident Evil 3 on the lowest settings got us an average of 41.4 frames per second and a 1% low of 27.4 frames per second. This game felt fairly playable, but it did stutter at times. I tried to test Red Dead Redemption 2 for this video, but the GTX 960M and its measly 2 gigabytes of video memory just wasn't able to play this at 1080p. I would load the game up, I would try to turn down the settings all the way, the meter would say, hey, the game is using too much video memory. Screw it, let's just go ahead and see what it does. It would load, and then it would go to a black screen, and then the computer would freeze, and I would have to hard boot the computer, and yeah, so I don't know what the deal is. I even reinstalled the game and the operating system, and it still would not play. Now, if you turn down the resolution, like let's say 720p, then the game would probably load and work fine, but for me, I'm really wanting to try to test everything at the screen's native resolution, which in this case is 1080p. Killing Floor 2 on medium got us an average of 78.1 frames per second and a 1% low of 52.5 frames per second. Despite the footage being choppy, the game actually was pretty smooth and was running above 60 frames most of the time. It even occasionally went up into the low hundreds. So even with a little bit of stutter, it was really smooth to play. Grand Theft Auto 5 on the lowest settings got us an average of 50.2 frames per second and a 1% low of 38.3 frames per second. The game ran better when you were out in the country/wilderness areas. The frames would usually stay in the mid to upper 50s, but then when you went into the city, it would drop into the 40s and sometimes dip into the upper 30s. Far Cry 5 on the lowest settings got us an average of 31.3 frames per second and a 1% low of 20.1 frames per second. The game mostly ran in the upper 20s, but occasionally would go up into the 30s, but that was usually when you were indoors. Counter-Strike Global Offense on the high preset got us an average of 84.6 frames per second and a 1% low of 50.4 frames per second. Counter-Strike ran pretty well, and the only time I ever really saw it dip below 60 was like on the victory screen, you know, the screen after someone loses or wins. So besides that, the game ran really well. Overwatch on the medium preset got an average of 66.2 frames per second and a 1% low of 44.3 frames per second. The game played very well and it felt pretty smooth to play. Warzone on the lowest setting gave us an average of 25.4 frames per second and a 1% low of 14.5 frames per second. This game was really stuttery and it was very, very hard to play. Fortnite on the low preset got us an average of 57.9 frames per second and a 1% low of 29.6 frames per second. Gameplay mostly stayed in the upper 50s but would occasionally drop and there were frequent stutters. Metro Exodus on the lowest settings got us an average of 37.8 frames per second and a 1% low of 26.5 frames per second. Metro ran a lot better than I expected, but it would still drop in the 20s every once in a while. And finally we have Cinebench R20. I did 3 runs and averaged it, and that average came out to be 1615. So a lot better than the other laptops we've looked at. I felt like with this laptop, the graphics card was the weak link, whereas the processor and the amount of RAM were quite exceptional. Now granted, it is a graphics card from back in 2015, so I have to give it some slack, but still, the CPU and the amount of RAM seem perfectly acceptable for today's standards. This laptop is a decent performer and would be great as a budget editing rig for like photos or video, with also light gaming ability as well. And that's not only because of the CPU and the amount of RAM, but you get a nice big 17-inch screen, and it's also pretty color accurate as well. A good setup for something like that would be a small SATA M.2 drive as the main operating system drive, along with all like your programs and whatnot, and then have a large, let's say 2 terabyte regular hard drive as like the data and games drive. That way, you know, your operating system boots up fast, your programs pull up fast, and then you have 2 terabytes of storage for any type of media that you're doing, as well as if you have some games, because games are getting pretty big now. Anyways, that's my take on the Asus GL752VW. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.